Today, we're diving into a really fascinating paper from the European Journal of Political Economy. It's called The Effect of International Sanctions on the Size of the Middle Class in Iran. It's from Mohammad Reza Farzanegin at Philipps University Marburg and Nader Habibi over at Brandeis University, and they ask a really powerful question about a major economic story.
See, for a long time, the story in Iran was all about progress. After the war, the country saw this really steady, consistent growth in its middle class. It was a time when things were really looking up, with growing prosperity and opportunity for a huge part of the population.
But then, all of that positive momentum just came to a grinding halt. After decades of growth, that engine of social mobility basically seized up right around the year 2012. And that brings up this massive question, one that's almost impossible to answer just by looking at what actually happened. What if that climb had just kept going? What was lost? Well, that's exactly what this paper tries to figure out. The researchers found a pretty ingenious way to create a counterfactual, basically a version of reality that lets us measure the real impact of what happened. Okay, so first, let's just look at the data that shows how stark this interruption really was. I mean, just look at this chart. For about 15 years, it's an incredible story. The middle class more than doubles, climbing all the way up to nearly 65% of the population by 2011. But then, the trend just snaps and reverses. The big question is, why? And the critical context is right here. That turning point, 2012, lines up perfectly with the start of severe international sanctions that targeted Iran's financial and oil industries. This is the exact event the researchers wanted to isolate. So how on earth do you measure the impact of something by looking at what didn't happen? Well, the researchers used this really clever statistical tool to build a kind of what-if version of Iran. It's called the synthetic control method, and you can think of it like building a virtual twin. It analyzes all these different factors in Iran before the sanctions, and then it creates a synthetic Iran by combining pieces of other countries that, when you put them all together, created a near-perfect mimic of Iran's economic path, right up until 2012.
The process is really logical when you break it down. First, they mapped out Iran's economic DNA before 2012. Then they basically let a computer figure out the perfect recipe of other countries that, when you blend them together, perfectly matched that DNA. This special blend becomes the control group, the what-if Iran that never had to deal with those sanctions.
And here is that exact recipe. This synthetic Iran is mostly made of Tunisia, with big chunks of Qatar, Malaysia, Azerbaijan, and a little bit of Indonesia. Now, this isn't just some random mix. This is the specific combination that best mirrored Iran's journey before the sanctions hit. So, what happens when you put the real Iran next to its synthetic twin after 2012? Well, the gap that opens up between them, that's where you see the true impact of the sanctions. After 2012, the two paths split, and they split dramatically. In that what-if world, without sanctions, the middle class probably would have just kept on growing. But in the real world, it stalled and then started to shrink. That growing space between the two lines is what the paper calls the sanctions gap. And the study actually puts a number on that gap. On average, between 2012 and 2019, the middle class in Iran was 17 percentage points smaller each year than it would have been in the synthetic, sanction-free world. That is an absolutely massive difference. So we know what happened, but the paper goes even deeper and explains how it happened. These sanctions weren't just some abstract policy. They worked through very specific economic channels that hit families right where they live. And here are the mechanics of that squeeze. Compared to its virtual twin, real income per person in Iran dropped by about $3,000. Imports, investment, industrial output, they all just plummeted. At the exact same time, vulnerable employment, less secure, informal jobs, that went up. These are the pathways that literally pushed families out of the middle class.
And a shrinking middle class isn't just an economic data point. It has these huge, profound consequences for the social and political fabric of an entire country.
Political scientists have been arguing for a long time that a strong, stable middle class kind of acts as a social anchor. As Samuel Huntington put it, it can be the bridge between the rich and the poor, which helps lower social tension and builds a foundation where democratic institutions can actually grow. When that foundation weakens, everything gets a lot shakier.
And this wasn't just some abstract economic shift. People felt this in their everyday lives. According to the World Values Survey, The number of Iranians who actually saw themselves as middle income dropped by 15 points between 2005 and 2020. People's very idea of their own place in society had changed.
Okay, so to pull this all together, what are the big takeaways? Well, first, the severe sanctions in 2012 stopped decades of progress dead in its tracks. Second, these synthetic Iran models suggest the middle class could have been, on average, 17 percentage points larger every year without them. Third, this happened through clear economic hits to income, trade, and investment. And finally, a shrinking middle class has really serious implications that go way beyond just the economy.
Ultimately, what this research does is it takes a high-level policy debate and grounds it in very real, tangible outcomes. It shows that international sanctions, which are designed as a tool of foreign policy, had a direct and measurable effect on the fortunes and the social structure of a nation. It leaves us with a really critical question to think about. No matter what the political goal is, who is it that ultimately pays the price?